Welcome back to part 2 of Module 66, Fiscal Policy Basics. The government budget and total spending. So we know that there are two types of government spending, government purchases and government transfers. Well, what can the government do to increase real GDP? Like, here, let's draw an economy in a recessionary gap. Price level, real GDP, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. That's where the economy is in short run equilibrium. Now, where is our long run aggregate supply curve going to go? Is it going to go over here on the left or over here on the right? Well, in a recessionary gap or a recession, GDP is low. Output is low. They're not making as much stuff as they could be. So the long run aggregate supply curve represents the amount of real GDP they could be making. The dot at short run equilibrium represents what they are making. So in this situation, it means that the real GDP is lower than it could be, which means that unemployment is quite high. All right, well, GDP, or actually let's add in real GDP, equals C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. And remember, exports minus imports means net exports, that NX. All right, so those are the sources of aggregate demand. So what we could do is we could say that aggregate demand equals real GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So what if we're in this situation and the government wants to help us get out of that situation? Well, if the government can help C, I, G, or NX raise, then aggregate demand will raise. Now, if aggregate demand increases, what will happen? Well, if we go back to our graph here, if aggregate demand increases, we will be back at long-run equilibrium, and our output will have gone up from like here to here. Our output would have increased. So if the government can help C, I, G, or NX go up, then aggregate demand will go up, which means that real GDP will go up, which also means then if real GDP goes up, then the unemployment rate goes down. And isn't that what we want, right? Like the whole point of this is to help real GDP go up and the unemployment rate to go down. All right, so here are the things that the government can do. The government can spend more money, which just means that government spending increases. A big example of that is them spending more money on infrastructure projects. Infrastructure is kind of like the structures that are in place that allow us to build up our society on it. So if you're talking about like physical infrastructure, you're talking about our roads, our bridges, our anything that's under the ground, like our sewers, our gas lines, our electrical lines, which are sometimes above and sometimes below. All of those things are our infrastructure. And a lot of times when the government wants to increase government spending, to therefore increase aggregate demand, to therefore increase real GDP and decrease unemployment, they will focus on infrastructure projects. Because not only does that, put more people back to work, does that increase government spending, but then it has that added lasting effect that we have great infrastructure. In like the 1950s, they made a huge push to increase the infrastructure in our country. And they created these like huge highways that we have going from state to state, our interstate highway system, like Interstate 35 and Interstate 94. Those were created, and we still have them today. And the government, they keep talking about doing that again. Yes, we're going to increase our infrastructure. And it's something that Democrats agree on and Republicans, which is like hardly anything at all, but they still haven't done it. So, I don't know. Ask your government teacher about that one. But anyway, not boo to your government class, just boo to the government not getting that done, in my opinion. All right, so if government spending goes up, therefore aggregate demand goes up, therefore real GDP goes up, and as we've talked about a bunch before, if real GDP goes up, if they're making more stuff, then the companies need to hire more people to make more stuff, which means that the unemployment rate goes down. All right, here we have, they can tax people less, meaning that if people have more disposable income to spend, right? If they lower people's taxes, people will have more money to go out and spend, which will increase consumption, therefore increase aggregate demand, therefore increase real GDP, and lower unemployment. Okay. Now, number 3. They can give people more money in transfer payments. And again, just like with decreasing taxes, increasing transfer payments causes people to have more disposable income to spend. So increasing transfer payments doesn't increase government spending because the transfer payment itself, it's just moving the money from one place to another. So, like, nothing got bought. So, but once that money gets moved from the government to people in the form of transfer payments, then that means that consumption will go up because people will have more money to spend. So again, consumption goes up, aggregate demand goes up, real GDP goes up, unemployment rate goes down. Okay, and then they can also, just like they can tax people less, they can tax businesses less, which means that firms have more money to invest and spend, which means investment spending or spending done by businesses go up. Therefore, just like before, aggregate demand goes up, real GDP goes up, unemployment rate goes down. So these are the things that the government can do if they're in a recessionary gap to try to get us out of that recessionary gap. And we're going to give that even more detail on page 3. Now, for some reason, page 3 is already filled out for you, so okie dokes. I'm not real sure how that happened, but it happens. Okay, so there are 2 different types of fiscal policy, expansionary and contractionary. Now, if you expand something, you make it bigger. And if you are contracting something, you're actually making it smaller. If something contracts, it's getting smaller. Not to be confused with a contract, which is an agreement. Spelled the same, but different. Okay. Darn that English language. All right, so expansionary policy is done during a recessionary gap, and it is meant to expand GDP. Contractionary fiscal policy is done during an inflationary gap, and it's meant to contract or shrink GDP. So we just discussed these things on the last page. So here they are, just written again, right? So if the government is in a recession, the government can choose to, if they want to help get out of that recession, they can choose to increase government spending, decrease personal income taxes, increase transfer payments, or decrease corporate or business taxes. And here is that chart again. I wish it wasn't already filled out for you. You might find value in just grabbing a piece of paper or your notebook and just drawing it again, so that you get that practice of labeling your price level and your real GDP, and of drawing your economy in a recessionary gap, and labeling your short-run aggregate supply, your long-run aggregate supply, your AD, and then your first equilibrium point. Now at that first equilibrium point, the price level would be here, and the real GDP, which you can label as Y, would be there. And then we just said that they're going to increase aggregate demand, so that would be that rightward shift, and draw it so that it brings it back to long run equilibrium. So now we have a new equilibrium point, which means we have a new price level, and we have a new level of real GDP, which is on our long run aggregate supply curve, which is awesome. So what that means, if the government does one of these four things, or maybe more than one, they can do more than one at once. The idea is, what they're hoping is that it'll cause the aggregate demand to shift enough to bring us back at long run equilibrium, okay, which we have here. And so the outcome, we can see that the real GDP increased. And if the real GDP increases, that means the unemployment rate decreases. But then we can also see that our price level went up. So price level going up, that's inflation, right? So what they're saying is that if the economy is in a recessionary gap, the government can do these four things to help bring us out of the recessionary gap. But there will be a consequence. The consequence will be inflation. But, with inflation also comes rising wages, so hopefully it balances itself out. The problem comes when we have inflation, but without rising wages, then our real income goes down, and we don't like that. So then, on the right-hand side, we're thinking from the point of view of an inflationary gap. And if that economy is like too hot, and it could cause a lot of inflation. So if the government chose to, they could try to decrease or slow down the economy, and they could do it by just doing the opposite, right? So here they increased government spending, well, here they're going to decrease it. Decrease personal income taxes, increase taxes. Although the government doesn't do that very often because nobody likes that. 3, increase transfer payments. Here's decrease transfer payments. And then, of course, increase corporate taxes. And so it would have that opposite effect. Well, so here you would draw an economy in an inflationary gap. So in an inflationary gap, where does the long-run aggregate supply curve go? Well, if the economy is here, that means that that level of real GDP is actually above the long-run aggregate supply curve. So the long-run aggregate supply curve goes over there to the left. And then if the government wanted to do one of these four things, or more than one, then that would have the impact of decreasing aggregate demand, which then what would the outcome of that be? Well, the outcome is that real GDP started here and it decreased, so it went down. If real GDP goes down, the unemployment rate goes up. And then the price level started here and then it went down. So the price level went down, which is called deflation. Now, we don't hear a lot about this kind of stuff like in the news. The government doesn't talk about it. It's not popular for politicians to be like, the economy's so good, we're going to raise your taxes. Like, they just don't really do that very much. We definitely hear way more about this expansionary fiscal policy that happens during when the economy is bad, when the economy is not doing well. You will see the government increase their spending. You will see the government decrease taxes, and you will see them increasing transfer payments. Now, just on a little side note to match with your government class a little bit, you guys have studied, the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. Democrats tend to want to do more fiscal policy when the economy is bad, and the Republicans tend to do less of it and let the economy fix itself more, because these things are not perfect, which is what the next page is about, page 4. So ways that fiscal policy might not work, which means that if we are in a recessionary gap and the government enacts fiscal policy, what they're hoping is that this will happen, right? That the new aggregate demand curve will bring it back to long-run equilibrium. But what happens if the new aggregate demand curve only brings it like halfway there? Yes, it will help a little, but it won't bring us back to long-run equilibrium. Or what if it doesn't move that aggregate demand curve at all? What if the government did all that fiscal spending or all that fiscal policy, but nothing new happened? Well, there could be two reasons why fiscal policy wouldn't work. The first one is called crowding out. And that's an argument that government spending leads to consumers and businesses spending less money. So they're saying that, government spending goes up, but therefore the C and the I go down. Here, let's add C goes down, I goes down. And why would that happen? Well, because if government spending goes up, that could increase interest rates. Why would government spending go up, increased interest rates? Because of our market for loanable funds. Loanable funds. If government spending goes up, well, we have our supply of loanable funds, our demand for loanable funds, and then we have our interest rate and our quantity. So if the price level goes up, or excuse me, that's not what I meant to say. If government spending goes up, that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. If government spending goes up, the demand for loanable funds will increase. Okay? Because the government needs to take out loans to do most of that spending. This is supposed to be an L and an F. Sorry, demand for loanable funds. So as you can see that it started there, it went up to there. So if government spending goes up, interest rates will go up. Therefore, investment spending will go down. Businesses will stop taking out as much loans because the prices are higher. So that is one reason. So here's one reason why they argue that crowding out will happen. And then the second reason is this argument that consumers won't buy something because the government gave it to them. For example, if the government builds a library, then consumers might spend less money on books. So which means, government spending went up, but consumer spending went down. But it's argued that these arguments are false during recessionary gaps because the government is using unused or idle resources that the private sector wasn't using anyway. So there are pretty strong arguments against crowding out, but there is that argument out there, that idea that, government spending might not fix all of our problems because of crowding out. Now, there is also the second reason why might fiscal policy not work, because of lags, right? If something is lagging, it's behind. And so lags, that's time between what the economy needs and the fiscal policy starting to work. Okay, so it takes time to, here, let's just go in order of this. So it says lags can cause the government to make the wrong decisions about fiscal policy and could actually destabilize the economy. Well, why does it take so long? Well, first of all, the government has to figure out what type of gap we're in. If we're in a recessionary gap, how far into it are we? Or are we in an inflationary gap? That takes time. It takes time to measure the real GDP. It takes time to measure the unemployment rate. And if the unemployment rate went down, is it a trend where it's going to continue to go down, or did it just go down and it was just a little blip? So they have to figure all that out, and then they have to pass the laws, which takes them forever because they argue about everything. And so if they actually get a law passed about the fiscal policy, then they have to actually begin the project. So let's go back to infrastructure. Let's go back to, this happened a lot during the Great Recession. So President Obama was the president, and we were in this terrible recession, and he said, okay, we are going to increase government spending on infrastructure. So the idea was that they would build more infrastructure, which would therefore increase government spending. So like if they're building a lot of stuff, then the businesses who like, if they're going to build a new railroad, then the companies, like the construction workers, then, sorry, my computer's doing something weird. Then the construction workers then have a job. And the people who sell the steels for the railroads have a job. And the people who like make the rail cars have a job. So that's all good stuff, right? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So they're going to build this new railroad. They increase government spending on all that stuff. And then more people have jobs. So then that'll help increase consumer spending. But then they actually have to begin the project. So you know how the green line goes all the way into, I think it's the green line or the blue line, I don't know. The light rail goes all the way into St. Paul now, into downtown. And then they redid that Union Depot in downtown St. Paul, and they made it look really nice, and now it gets used again. Well, that was government spending, fiscal policy spending during the Great Recession that started in 2008. That took forever to get started because, okay, so the government, like, they'll say, let's enact fiscal policy. Well, what kind? Let's do infrastructure. And then they'll pass the law on it. And then they have to actually begin the project, which takes like sometimes years. So fiscal policy can sometimes take so long, which means that, it doesn't do a great job at improving the economy, especially right away. That's it for Module 66. Do not forget to do your summary and to read the textbook and to do the practice problems and to come to class and all that. Bye, guys.